All right. So, I want to tell you a story. This is an ancient Taoist story, a story from the Taoist tradition. And it's a story about a stone cutter, a man who made his living cutting stones. And this man, who's the stone cutter, was very dissatisfied with his life. And everywhere he looked, he saw people doing other things that he wished he could do, better than him. They made more money, they were more powerful, they were this, they were that, and he was very dissatisfied with his life, being a stone cutter. And one day, as he was walking to work, he was walking down the road, and he passes a big mansion. And the mansion's doors happened to be open. There was a party or meeting, something was happening at this mansion. And he could see inside, and he saw that in the mansion was beautiful artwork. There was music playing, candles, lots of people, clearly wealthy, important people based by how they were dressed, artists, writers, musicians, the leaders of the community. And he looked at that scene, and he thought to himself, wow, now that life looks great. I wished that I was like the wealthy merchant who owns that house. I wished I were the wealthy merchant. And poof, as if by magic, he became the wealthy merchant. And at first, being the wealthy merchant was fantastic. And he lived in the house, and he met all these people, and he was surrounded by the beautiful artwork and the music. And at first, it was fantastic. But then, shortly thereafter, he started noticing that the people weren't really there because they liked him. They were there because they wanted to borrow money, or they wanted something from him. And he had to always be careful about the stuff that was in his house. He had to hire guards to make sure nobody took anything. And he was a wealthy businessman, a wealthy merchant, so he had to really think about his business. And he realized that running this wealthy business took more time and effort than he ever thought it would. And he thought to himself, wow, being a wealthy merchant wasn't exactly what I thought it would be. And he, once again, was unhappy. And one day, he was sitting in this beautiful mansion looking at the big picture window that looked out onto the street and the square in front of him in the middle of town. And all of a sudden came this procession. And in the middle of a procession was the powerful magistrate who ruled the region. And he was in a throne that was made of beautiful leather and fabrics. And he was dressed beautifully. And that throne was on one of those platforms that were carried on the backs of all these very muscular men. And in the front of the procession and in the back of the procession was the royal army. And everywhere this procession went up and down the streets of the city, everywhere people would bow in front of this royal magistrate. And the man who was the stonecutter, who now was the wealthy businessman, the wealthy merchant, thought, oh, that's amazing. Look at the power this man has. Everywhere he goes, he's carried on the backs of all these men. He's surrounded by the army, and everywhere he goes, people bow to him. What power this man has. And he said, I wished I was the all-powerful magistrate. And poof, as if by magic, he became the powerful magistrate. And at first, it was awesome to be on that throne high above everyone else, dressed in the finest silks and clothes, being carried through all the streets of the city, and everywhere he went, people bowing to him. But soon, he began to discover some things. First, he discovered that when people bowed to him, they resented him for the power he had. Not all of them wished him well. They were made to bow. They didn't do so willingly. That's why the army was there. And he noticed something else, that being an all-powerful magistrate was a lot of responsibility. It took a lot of time. And there were a lot of duties that he had no idea that he had to do before he became one. And so he was unhappy again. And even worse, sitting on that throne, going through the streets, wearing all of those fine clothes, it was very hot. And he found himself sweating and feeling very uncomfortable in that chair. And he looked up at the sun, and he thought, wow, how powerful is the sun? That sun is so amazing. You know where I'm going with this, right? That sun is so amazing. It's so much more powerful than any of us humans can be. That sun is great. I wish I were the sun. And what? One more time. And as if by magic, very well done. As if by magic, the stonecutter who became the wealthy businessman, who became the powerful magistrate, now became the sun. How great. And at first, it was amazing. He shone brightly. His light, he just let it go. He was so bright and so warm. And now, from this vantage point, instead of seeing the city that he was in from the ground, now he could see the entire city and the region and the farms and everything around it. He said, this is amazing. This is the most powerful place to be. But shortly, the heat radiating from the sun caused damage, heat damage to the crops, and the crops failed. And it dried up all the water that was down on the ground, and so there was now drought. And the people would look up at the sun and go like this because they were mad that the sun was doing all of this. And he thought to himself, being the sun is not exactly what I thought it would be. So he was unhappy. But then a gigantic storm cloud came. And he noticed that the storm cloud blocked the sun from the land. And he thought, there's something more powerful than the sun that could block the sun from reaching the land? The storm cloud is even more powerful than the sun. How great it would be to be the storm cloud. And he thought to himself, I wish I was the storm cloud. And as if by magic, guess what happens? He became the storm cloud. And at first, I am going somewhere with this, by the way. I'm sure. And at first, it was awesome. Thank you. Because now he was floating and he was filled with all that moisture. And he could block the sun to provide restorative shade to the ground and people below. But then he noticed something. As he began to rain down on the ground, at first it was great. But then as the rains kept coming and the storms and the rains kept going and going and going, there was so much water now down on the ground that there was a flood. And trees were flooded and the bridges were washed out from all of the rain and the water. And the people in the town were raising their fists at the cloud, angry at what it had done. And he thought to himself, being a storm cloud is not all I thought it would be. You can almost tell this story to me. And he was unhappy. But then he found himself being moved. Here he is, this enormous storm cloud, and he's being moved. Pay attention, I'm getting to the end. He's being moved. And he thought, what is more powerful than the storm cloud that it could move me? And he realized it was wind. And he thought, the wind must be the most powerful thing there is. The wind, it must be so great to be the wind. I wish I were the wind. And as if by magic, guess what he became? And at first it was great. He was free, he was flowing, he was everywhere. It was I'm pointing at this guy over here. He's feeding me my words. It was amazing. It was what? Awesome. It was awesome. He's right. It was awesome. And he could move everything. But very soon after, he noticed something. As the wind, he began to get more and more powerful, and those trees were uprooted, and the roofs on the buildings and the homes were being taken off by the wind. And all this destruction and damage started happening because of the wind. And the people would come out in the streets and they would raise their fists in anger at the wind. And he thought to himself, gee, being the wind is not all that I thought it would be. And he was unhappy. But at least he was the wind, the most powerful thing there was, right? Until, as the wind, he came up across something he could not move. It was even stronger than the wind. He could not in any way make this thing move. And what it was were these great cliffs made of rock. And they were so powerful and so heavy and so dense that even the powerful wind that could cause all this destruction could not even move these big cliffs of rock, even a little bit. And he thought to himself, gee, there's something even more powerful than the wind? It's these rocks. He thought the rocks must be the most powerful thing there is. I wish I were the rocks, these gigantic rocks. And he became these giant cliffs of rock. Oh, he said, this is it. This is the most powerful thing there is. I'm solid. I'm huge. I'm ancient. I'm dense. Nothing can move me. Not even the all-powerful wind can affect me. Not even the sun. Not even the storm clouds with the rain. Nothing can affect me at all. Finally, I am the most powerful there is. Until one day, something started piercing him. And piercing him. And it began to drive into him, and little chips of him started coming away. And he thought, what's doing that? What's poking me? And then chips of me fall away. What's even more powerful than the rock? And he looked down, and he saw one solitary man, a stonecutter. And he recognized that the most powerful thing on earth was who he had been and who he now became once again. That's a long story, isn't it? But it's a good story. And it's a story, what's that? It's a good story because it's a story that tells the journey of our life. What we're talking about right now is Taoism, the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is the sacred book of Taoism, and it has 81 short verses. And in these 81 short verses is the entire spiritual journey. In 81 short verses. If you look at the science of mind and the Tao Te Ching, they ultimately say the same thing. And it's good to have both of them. But in this beautiful, brief, almost verse poem-like sacred book is the entire sacred journey. And Taoism, one of the tenets of Taoism is to